Get ready to ignite your Tuesday nights with a show that's as educational as it is entertaining. Welcome to Pleasure Pulse, your weekly guide to the world of sex education. Join Roma every Tuesday night from 8 to 9 p.m. exclusively on Zolized Radio 96.1 FM. It's the perfect way to spice up your midweek routine and get answers to all your burning questions. Whether you're looking for relationship advice or curious about the art of intimacy, Roma's got you covered. Pleasure Pulse, every Tuesday night from 8 to 9 p.m. Only on Zolized Radio 96.1 FM. Don't miss out. Your sex education journey starts this Tuesday with Roma as your guide.
This is RIZ Radio. Time is now 11 minutes, moving away from 8 o'clock. And we say good night to Roma. She's here in the studio with us tonight for another edition of Pleasure Pulse.
Good night, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of Pleasure Pulse. I'm your host, Roma Richardson, and we are here to talk about another sex-related topic as usual. Apologies for the lateness. That was my fault. And I hope that everybody is doing well tonight. I know you missed me last week. I was sick. Luckily, I don't think I had what was going around or the full brunt of what is going around, rather. So I'm here again tonight. Grateful to be with you all for another Tuesday. But as usual, before we get into tonight's topic and tonight's conversation, especially since we're starting a bit late, I'm going to give you all some time to let everybody know that Pleasure Pulse is on. Share the live, all of that, so that we can get into tonight's, I think, really, no, I was going to say exciting, but I don't want to say exciting because it's not exciting. It's important, an important topic. So I'll give you all a few, let everybody know Pleasure Pulse is live, and then we'll come right back and get into tonight's discussion. So stay tuned.
Get ready to ignite your Tuesday nights with a show that's as educational as it is entertaining. Welcome to Pleasure Pulse, your weekly guide to the world of sex education. Join Roma every Tuesday night from 8 to 9 p.m. exclusively on Zolized Radio 96.1 FM. It's the perfect way to spice up your midweek routine and get answers to all your burning questions. Whether you're looking for relationship advice or curious about the art of intimacy, Roma's got you covered. Pleasure Pulse, every Tuesday night from 8 to 9 p.m. Only on Zolized Radio 96.1 FM. Don't miss out. Your sex education journey starts this Tuesday with Roma as your guide.
Welcome back to Pleasure Pulse. You're tuned into ZIZ Radio, ZIZ on Facebook and on YouTube. So we should be up and running. You should be seeing me. We've got cool technology happening here. I have to go back and view it to see what it looks like, but it looks cool from what I'm seeing. Anyway, so tonight I wanted to talk about something that, you know, I have like 100+ topics or subtopics within sex, sexuality, sexual violence, and so on that I plan to touch on for Pleasure Pulse. And sometimes, you know, things are like I have episodes planned in advance in my head and I follow up with, you know, continuing conversation and so on. Or sometimes something happens, you know, culturally or in our space where we are that prompts a particular topic. And that latter situation is what is actually inspiring tonight's conversation, which is, and I've said this before, I'm a chronically online person, but I think even if you are not a chronically online person, you may have seen the video or heard about the situation where a woman was retelling a story of being on a bus and them stopping for a child and the bus driver instructing the child to sit on a stranger's lap, a male stranger's lap. And you know, persons in the bus seem to have an issue with the idea of the child sitting on the stranger's lap, which I agree with, because why? In 2025, And I also had some issues, because I've been to other Caribbean countries where overloading a bus is common because getting home is the most critical thing, and people travel much longer distances. It might be raining or whatever. So if you need to get home, you squeeze up if you need to squeeze up. That's not really something that we practice here. So I was surprised to hear of it happening in the first place. But then when we think about, the value or lack thereof that we place on children's autonomy, independence, ability to decide for themselves what it is they want to do, then I kind of can't understand why something like that would happen. And by that I mean, like, we might not really ask a child, are you okay with XYZ? We might just instruct the child to do whatever it is. So the person talked about this situation and talked about, how she responded, and going as far as to ask, if people around her knew the child or knew who the child was related to and things like that. But I more paid attention to like the response of people online, and a lot of folks were, responding to the poster or to like reshares of the story, talking about like why the woman who told the story didn't invite the child to sit on her lap instead of allowing the child to sit on a male stranger's lap, and so on. And so it's inspired me to talk about child sexual abuse. And at the end, I'm going to come back around to share a bit of what I maybe would have, what I might recommend if a situation like that comes up again. And of course, I'm not a parent, so it's also very important for parents to talk to their own children, to let them know what is okay and what is not okay, or to provide them with the tools to be able to identify what is okay and what is not okay, especially if they are, a certain age where they are moving around in the world without parental supervision, whether that is you send them down to the shop by themselves, or they walk to school by themselves and walk back home for them by themselves, because there's so much going on in the world right now. I mean, if you're paying attention to news, most of us have heard about the situation in Antigua with the child who was kidnapped and killed leaving school. So it's also a particularly timely topic, as difficult and uncomfortable as it is to talk about. Child sexual abuse is very much a reality. And we have talked about sexual assault of adults. And I think we have also, touched on child sexual abuse and the impacts and the effects that it can have. But I wanted to re-up this conversation, particularly in context of this situation with the bus. So, firstly, child abuse is a cycle. And I'm thinking about how I want to do this. I think I'm going to provide a definition first, so that we can frame our conversation within that meaning. So according to the CDC, which is the Centers for Disease Control in the U.S., child sexual abuse refers to the involvement of a child, which is a person less than 18 years old, in sexual activity that violates the laws or social taboos of society and that of the child. And that the child does not fully comprehend, does not consent to, or is unable to give informed consent to, is not developmentally prepared for, and cannot give consent to. So let me repeat that. So child sexual abuse refers to the involvement of a child, which is a person less than 18 years old. That's how a lot of people define child. In sexual activity that violates the laws or social taboos of society, and that the child does not fully comprehend, does not consent to, or is unable to give informed consent to, and is not developmentally prepared for and cannot give consent to. Okay, so one of the key things that I want to mention and that I want us to remember and take away from this conversation is that child abuse is a cycle. So anybody who is victimized as a child can potentially become an abuser themselves. And the statistics show, the data shows that children who experience or witness violence are more likely to perpetrate or experience it as adults. And we also know that rates of reporting are smaller than rates of experience. So way more people experience child sexual abuse than actually report it to adults or to police. But, and this is like a side note, but a related point, I just wanted to touch on, and this is why, you know, for me, the situation with the bus was like particularly interesting, because the recommendation to go to a similar stranger, a person who is similarly unknown to the child, but is a woman, was an interesting one, particularly when we think about the fact that there are female child sexual abusers. So everybody recommending, and not to say that the person who told the story is a child sexual abuser, right? But we don't know people, right? And we don't know, and this is not for this person in particular, but there is this belief that some strangers are safe and some strangers are unsafe just based on their gender alone. Of course, the majority of perpetrators of sexual assault of adults and child sexual abuse are male, are men, but there are some women who perpetrate child sexual abuse. So this is why I'm bringing in this point, right? So we know that rates of reporting are smaller than rates of experience, but among boys, where culturally interest from older women is celebrated and lauded, and in spaces where in spaces in general that by default eliminate women from the abuser pool, how many cases do we think of female perpetrated sex abuse goes unreported and perhaps even unrecognized and improperly labeled? For example, one of the things that really grinds my gears and grinds other people's gears from what I see on social media when we're in the carnival season is adult women who either initiate or allow dancing with little boys at carnival. That is a form of inappropriate activity with children that we don't call out as much as we absolutely should. And we need to make it clear to ourselves, and we also need to make it clear for the sake of our children that abusers can come in any shape or form, any gender. They can be strangers, but the majority of sexual violence is perpetrated by somebody who is known to people. So whether that is the adult or the child, the majority of sexual abuse is perpetrated by people known to you. So let me reiterate, this isn't about the specific teller of the story with the bus situation and so on, but I'm talking in general about our assumption that male strangers are not safe, but female strangers are safe to our children. And in addition to all of that, we have to remember that children do abuse other children. So it's not even like, we can let all of our guards down once our children are among children. It's important to, recognize that anybody can potentially be, an abuser, and anybody can potentially be at risk for abuse. So tonight, I'm not going to just dwell on the doom and gloom. I hope I never do that, even if I spend some time on it. But I want to talk about how we can keep our children safe, because it really did rub me the wrong way that we assumed that, some people are unsafe and other people are safe, while not knowing any of the people actually. And it's similar tangent to the way that we don't want male preschool teachers because we assume that men by default are unsafe to be around, but we don't attach or apply the same level of scrutiny or awareness to other teachers who might pose a similar risk. Maybe not a similar degree of risk based on, the statistics and the evidence, but who still do pose potentially a risk to our children. So tonight, I do want to talk about how we can keep our children safe from all, perpetrators. And of course, I'm going to get to this, but in addition to structural and systems-based strategies like changing norms and stereotypes, changing beliefs, how we think about people, those deeply ingrained ideas about who can cause harm and who cannot cause harm. So, for example, sometimes we think about older people as people being unable to cause harm. And this is also a side note. I have a lot of side notes, but all of them are relevant to the conversation. I was recently watching, what was it called on Netflix? I'm going to tell you. Not me looking it up right while we're right here. Worst Roommate Ever. That's what it was called. Worst Roommate Ever. And Worst Roommate Ever had one episode with this older man who has different tenants, but they live in his house. So they're kind of like roommates. And he seems so sweet, so harmless to everybody, and he ended up, as they say online, unaliving his two roommates. But it's the fact that just looking at people, we make certain decisions about what they're capable or not capable of, and those decisions, those conclusions can be very, very wrong, right? Okay, so in addition to these structural and systems-based strategies like changing norms and stereotypes and ideas in our heads about what people are, or people can or can't do, or what people should accept or not accept based on things like their gender or their age. For example, some of the ideas that we have regarding children and some of the things that we said that like anything past 12 is lunch, or beliefs that boys need to be initiated early in order to ensure heterosexuality or ensure that their penises grow and things like that. I'm going to share with you some practical and more immediate and short-term steps that you adults who have children in your care, whether you are parents, guardians, and so on, can do to protect children. And I know that there are a bunch of people who are like mandatory reporters. So you are responsible for being able to identify the signs, but also to report things that are told to you or so on. So I wouldn't necessarily say, you go take people's children and tell them so and so and so, but especially if you are teaching these topics, there is something in here that I believe you can use when talking to your children. If you're a grandparent of a child, if you have something that you've been wanting to, or ensure that your grandchildren learn about, and you're not really sure if you should do it yourself, you could have a conversation with their parents and see how maybe the two of you can approach the conversation or the conversations to keep the child safe. So a lot of this advice comes from RAIN, which is an organization in the U.S., and it stands for the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network. So first of all, it's important to understand and accept that sexual abuse unfortunately can happen to any child. And it's the same thing with rape and sexual assault. It can happen to anybody. And there is no 100% sure this is absolutely going to work way to protect children from sexual abuse or all forms of violence. But there are some steps that you can take to reduce the risk. And if something does happen to your child, it's very important that you remember, you're not to blame. The child is not to blame. The person who perpetrated the violence is the one to blame and the one to be held to account. So here are some steps that you can take to help to protect the children in your life. And you would, or maybe wouldn't, be surprised that a lot of them center around communication. And I like to talk about the 2 C's here: communication and consent. And building a relationship with your child is extremely important because it helps to create an environment where the child feels comfortable to tell you the good things, but also the not so good things, the concerning things, and the things that you might need support with. So being involved in your child's life, having a relationship with your child, being actively involved can help you to identify warning signs, or more quickly identify warning signs, make them more obvious to you, and also, as I mentioned, help the child feel more comfortable coming to you if something isn't right or if something has happened. And how do you do that? It's important to show interest in their day-to-day life. So you're talking to them about what they did today, who they played with, what they learned, where they played, whether they enjoyed themselves. You can ask them questions like that. You also want to get to know people in your child's life. So, oh my God. And this is also a related tangent. And it happened today, so I'm going to mention it. I am 33 years old, and up until this day, anytime I wave to anybody and my mother is with me, she asks me who that. So she has maintained, and perhaps, I don't know if this resource was out there then, but everybody that I have some interaction with, perhaps it's just nosiness, but a lot of times nosiness really does pay off and come in very handy. But up until now, she is interested in knowing who it is I, interact with, who it is I know, right? And if you have a child in your care, it's important to know those people in your child's life, like knowing who your child is spending time with, whether those people are children or adults. Sometimes, a lot of people, you get to know people through other people. So you might know your child's friend, but you might not know that your child's friend has an older sibling, and that older sibling is oftentimes around them in the same space or whatever. It's important for you to, get that deep, to ask your child about who their classmates are, who their parents are. I feel like we don't even do that anymore. Like, we don't know people. We don't know our people's. We don't know the children's peoples. And what happened to the days when it used to be like, oh, that's your friend? I went to her school with her sister, and her sister is this person, auntie, and yeah, we're actually related to these people from Newton Grong. Like, we need to get back to that. Like, that's not just community, but being able to identify the people in your communities can go a long way in keeping children safe And you can also talk about those folks openly and ask questions so that your children can feel comfortable doing the same to you, because I feel like one thing that I wanted to mention, especially about your children feeling comfortable doing the same to ask you about people. Growing up and going to school, there were certain adults around who made children feel uncomfortable, including me. And oftentimes, other adults knew that these adults made children feel uncomfortable, whether they, said inappropriate things to children or they touched children inappropriately, whether it was adults who looked inappropriately at children and were just generally creeps. And other adults would know about these, I'm gonna say, potentially pedophiliac, or pedophile adults, and would sometimes not say anything to the children in their care, or not say anything to other children. Or if you say it to the children in your case, more like, oh, just avoid this person. But it's not like actually taking steps to remove the adult who causes concern for children. It's the adult continuing to be the drama teacher or the sports coach or the pastor around the children or the youth group leader or the social club leader or whatever. And so, there are literal, actual, continuing ways in which children are exposed to harm that are potential harm that adults hear about, know about, and don't do anything about. And that is really, really concerning. A next thing to do to keep children safe is to choose caregivers carefully. Let me go back to, what I said before, because I recognize that, parents can only do so much. And in order for us to keep young people safe, it requires us to also address the perpetrators. So we can, if there are no perpetrators, then there is no perpetration, right? So it requires also us to address the actual perpetrators of violence. But in the meantime, while we're addressing those perpetrators, adults certainly can take more serious steps to make it clear to children that certain things are not acceptable, that certain behaviors will not be tolerated or excused or just pushed under the rug. Because once we start to when we normalize violence, right, including sexual violence, sexual abuse of children, then people start to believe that it's normal. If people treat it as something as something that just happens, then people come to see it as something that just happens. And I don't want to expect it, but I know I have definitely heard of cases where it's the parent said, well, I experienced it, so what's the issue if my child experiences it or my grandchild experiences it? So it's this anticipation or expectation that this thing will happen. So it's important for us, especially if we are not in the situation and can recognize the situation is happening, for us to take steps to support those families and those children and so on, and to believe that people deserve safe environments to grow up in and to do what we need to do to create those safe environments. Okay, so another thing that adults, parents can do to help to keep children safe and to reduce the risk of sexual violence is to choose caregivers carefully. So you remember what I was saying about, us believing that perpetrators only look a certain kind of way? A lot of times we think that is the boogeyman in the dark, and that has been disproven so many times, like so many times over, that it's not the boogeyman in the dark. A lot of times, like, it's the older cousin in the house, or it's the uncle, or it's the auntie, or it's the older sister, or it's the neighbor's child, whatever it is, right? So whether we're talking about babysitters, whether we're talking about schools and after school activity, clubs, church groups, social groups, it's important for us to screen caregivers for our for our children. And when it comes to evaluating caregivers, which we need to do, like, we can just be like, okay, this is me also understanding that sometimes there are really desperate situations where you just need someone to look after your child, and you are doing it with the highest hope that the person will prioritize the safety of your child and will not cause harm to your child. At the same time, it's still important for us to evaluate the people who are around our children, our child, and who are going to be providing care to our children. And that can look like contacting people who might know that person and asking them, to vouch for them, or whether they can vouch for them, asking about their character, about any situations that may have come up with them. Because like I mentioned, a lot of times we know the perpetrators, we know the pedophiles, we know the people who cause harm. So it's also a matter of being honest about that and being willing to ask about that. It's also important to, like, some people set up cameras in their home. So if that is something that is accessible to you, that's something that you can consider. And of course, that's for like babysitting and smaller children. But when you are sending your children to school and so on, you need to, as a parent or caregiver, be heavily involved. Like, your presence has to be felt. Like, everybody must know who that child's parent is, and that child's parent loves the child, cares about the child, is concerned about the child, prioritizes the safety and well-being of that child, and will do what it takes to prevent and reduce the risk of violence to that child, or will take steps to address any violence that has happened to the child, right? So it's important for us to evaluate the caregivers. So that means, talking to their teachers. If a situation comes up, and I don't mean like parents going up to the school to bang up teachers, that's not what I'm talking about. If a situation that comes up where your child talks about feeling uncomfortable, that's something that is definitely worth discussing with teacher, principal, whoever it is involved. And so we need to have, like, heavy involvement and heavy presence especially when our children are going to be in the care of other people. And after school activities, yes, please, because I feel like a lot of times we send our children to things because the person is good at that thing. So you send them to maths class or whatever it is because we want the children to learn maths class. But we don't really ask any questions beyond, like, the person's ability to teach math. We need to ask other questions, and we need to look into other aspects of that person and that person's behavior, history, past, all of those things, right? And if we find things out, we should not ignore those things because now our children are returning better grades or whatever. Because I'm going to tell you, like, the effects of child sexual abuse are long lasting, and they are so, sometimes the effects that you are seeing are not so obviously connected back to the child sexual abuse. But it's when you talk to folks, you find out the things that they have experienced in their lives that you can make some of those connections. So that is just to say, like, please, if certain things are reported to you, if certain things come to your attention or come to light, don't dismiss them because of what benefit you are getting instead. So choose caregivers carefully. And it's also important to know warning signs. So pay attention to what it might look like if your child is experiencing any sexual abuse. And that could also include things like grooming, where there hasn't been any or there might not have been any physical touching or penetration or so on, but where people are preparing them essentially for that stage or for that, I'm not saying stage, for that violence. So it's important for us to, familiarize ourselves with what the warning signs of child sexual abuse are. And I won't get into that today because that's a whole other conversation, but I will get into that at some point. It's also important to encourage our children to speak up. So when we have a good relationship with our children, and I'm saying I don't have any children, but I'm talking about a former child. And I'm talking as, people talk about like reparenting yourself or like teaching yourself all the things you wish that you had someone to tell you, or all the things that you wish you knew at the time. That's also, partly what I'm doing here. So when children know that their voices will be heard and taken seriously, it helps to give them the courage to speak up. Because one thing it is if you feel like nobody gonna listen to you, if you feel like you're gonna be dismissed, you ain't even nobody gonna say nothing. And we do that as adults, and children also do that too. So it's important for us to, start having conversations with children that helps to create and deepen that bond, to create that comfort and that rapport, so that when things happen, including things that are harmful or things that are violent activities, children can feel safe and like it will be beneficial to say something. It's also important to teach a child about boundaries and about their bodies. So I always talk about consent. My cousin has a 3-year-old son, and a couple of weeks ago, and you know how we have babies just running up and down the place naked. So they opened the door and he was naked and he was showing me his penis. And I was like, yeah. And remember that no one is allowed to touch your penis except mommy and daddy when they're bathing you and so on, and your trusted adults when they're bathing you or cleaning you. But no one is allowed to touch your penis without mommy and daddy present. For example, as I mentioned, unless it is a teacher or someone who is cleaning him since he's in preschool. But it's also important for preschoolers to know what is appropriate when they're being cleaned or when they're being helped, so that we prepare our children, we give them the tools to be able to identify when something feels off. And so there are, and the thing is, like, this isn't something that you start at age 12, right? This is something that you start from small. So he can identify his private parts. He can probably identify female private parts. And it's important to teach them the correct names of parts of their bodies, so that when they do, or if they do have to talk about something that has happened to them that didn't feel right, they can properly identify and discuss what they're speaking to. So as I mentioned, teach your child about boundaries, teach them that nobody has the right to touch them, teach them that like people can't just be including, mommy and daddy, which is why a lot of people practice, like when they're bathing children, like actually talking them through the process and letting them know what they're doing, saying, okay, I'm going to touch you here right now. I'm going to, wipe your bottom. I'm going to lift your arms. I'm going to clean your nipples, whatever it is, or your chest, whatever it is, right? And that also extends to things like hugging or kissing. So we should not force or very really even encourage our children to kiss or hug everyone. But we definitely shouldn't force them, including family members, because sometimes children, and sometimes we don't even realize it, right? Like sometimes children are hesitating to be close to a family member or to hug a family member or to kiss a family member, to be alone with a family member, because perhaps that family member has been, doing some inappropriate things with the child or has been causing some harm rather to the child, right? So it's important for us to even pay attention to that kind of stuff. Now, of course, like that might not be what's happening all of the time, but I think it's definitely worthwhile to consider it, not to dismiss it entirely and say, oh, that could never happen, but to keep it in mind, to monitor the behavior, to talk to your child about what it is causing that hesitance, but also to remind your child that, if they don't want to hug people, they don't have to hug people, and the adults just have to be okay with that, right? Or even things like tickling. So if you're playing with your child and your child tells you to stop as young as they are, stop means stop and no means no, because when we teach them otherwise, then as they grow up, they will not be able to identify what feels good to them or what they should allow and what they shouldn't allow. So it's important from young that we let children know that their bodies are their bodies. They can have boundaries, even with their parents, even with their siblings, and they don't have to do, when it comes to their body, anything that they don't want to do, obviously, except if it is to actually, protect them and ensure their safety and so on. It's important also to, when you're building this relationship with your child and helping to keep them safe, to give them chance to raise new topics. And that means sometimes asking questions. It means that sometimes asking certain questions isn't going to give you, the answers you need, especially if you're asking yes or no questions. When you're talking to children, you want to ask questions that will give them opportunities to expound, to elaborate, to bring up other things that maybe you didn't even think to ask about. It's just to create a space where there is an opportunity for something to come out if they need something to come out. And perhaps they have questions about sex. Perhaps they have questions about touching. Perhaps there's something that they saw on TV, or maybe there's something that they heard their friends talking about. Maybe there's something that happened with friends that they heard about in school that they're curious about and want to ask you, questions on. So open-ended questions will give you that opportunity for other things to be raised. So not just yes or no questions or direct questions, but questions like, what happened at school today? Or, when you're wrapping up the conversation, is there anything else that you want to talk about? Sometimes you can ask questions like, what did you think about XYZ? Especially if you both, have experienced something together, whether you were watching something together or whatever it is, But it's important for us to keep that space open for children to ask us back questions. So not to do all of the talking ourselves like I have done tonight, but to give them space to ask questions if they need to. So I, mentioned all of those things. Let me just recap them for you so that you can think about them some more when it comes to reducing risk and keeping children safe. Being involved in your child's life, showing interest in their daily lives, being familiar with the people in their life, evaluating your caregivers and choosing them carefully, knowing the warning signs, encouraging children to speak up, teaching them about boundaries and about their bodies, and giving them a chance to ask you back questions. So, all that said, I wanted to come back to how we started the show, which was the situation with the child sitting on a stranger's lap in the bus. And, I had this whole conversation about child safety because I found it interesting that most people's response to the storyteller was that she should have, invited the child to sit on her lap. And of course, I've said that was really interesting to me because in that is people's assumption that women cannot perpetrate, because obviously there's the discomfort with the girl child sitting on the male stranger's lap because we think that men are perpetrators of violence. But I found it interesting because women are also perpetrators of violence, including violence against children. So to complete the circle, to circle back, I wanted to come back to this story and share my recommendation or my suggestion, or my thoughts rather. My thoughts if a situation like that happens again, which it really shouldn't, because isn't that illegal? Like, if something had happened, wouldn't the bus driver be in trouble also for that? And why is it that we don't think that children deserve the autonomy and dignity and respect of a full seat like adults? Of course, we know that, children, what it is on the tree, I'm not sure, whatever, like lap age. Lap age is like 3, maybe 4. And this didn't seem obviously like a child who was lap age since they went shopping alone. So first of all, children deserve the respect and dignity of their own seat in a bus. So my thoughts are that concern for the child, if that bus insisted on stopping, which is commendable if it's about, being concerned about the child being out too long or having wait too long. An adult in the bus should have given up their seats to the child, is what I think. And it could have been any of those adults in the bus. Or, like how when we drop people home, we used to, and this is probably y'all gonna say an unrealistic recommendation, but like how we used to wait outside their house until they get inside, however long that take, because sometimes if you drop a young person home and they had to be knocking on the door for their parent to wake up, if it's a certain time their parent drop sleep, it might take 15 minutes, especially if it's my mother, for them to wake up. And you shouldn't leave anybody, but especially not a child, outside their house at night without any kind of, other human presence, right? So I'm also like, did you stop and wait? Did someone want to stop and wait on the side with the child until another bus came around? I don't know. But definitely would not recommend, would not suggest, don't agree with the idea of sit on another stranger's lap. If the child don't know anybody in the bus, give up your seat to the child so that the child can, if it's about child safety, so that the child can have a safe passage or a quicker passage home, but definitely not sit on somebody else's lap, because that's just not. And it's also like, if we go back to that idea about community and about knowing each other and knowing people and so on, like ideally, especially if the people are from the neighborhood, but maybe they weren't because it's a bus and people could be going anywhere. Ideally, there would be somebody in there who knows the person and who the child knows. And that's the important thing, right? Like, it's not enough to be like, oh, I know the child, so the child can sit on my lap. Like, the child also has to identify you as a safe person for them, right? So my thoughts are just, don't sit on anybody else's lap, and don't recommend that either, because safety is not statistically, like there are fewer female perpetrators, but that doesn't mean zero. So my recommendation is, if a situation like that happens again, that an adult can give up their seat to the child so that the child can have a quicker passage home. I hope tonight's conversation was, what did I say? I wanted to provide practical, short-term tips that you could use. So I hope that those were some practical and short-term tips that you could start to practice and start to apply to help to reduce the risk of sexual abuse among children. And it's unfortunately, something that we do have to contend with and think about in our daily lives. Like, the world is not perfect, even though I think it can be, but that's just me. And it's not violence free. And child sexual abuse is 100% preventable if we prevent it, if it is prevented. And so we have to take steps to reduce the risk of our children's exposure and experience of violence, or exposure to an experience of violence. And we also have to take the steps to prevent the violence before it happens, which also means addressing perpetrators and potential perpetrators of violence. And if I said at the top that child abuse is a cycle, meaning that people who are victimized as children can potentially become perpetrators themselves, then preventing child abuse means, as in preventing child abuse for future children, means preventing child abuse for current children. So when we start it, as a cycle will do, then we can see the effects of that reduction of violence. So let us do what we can to keep our children safe. Let us not make any assumptions about anyone. Let us keep in mind that the majority of child sexual abuse is perpetrated by somebody known to the child. The statistics I saw from the US were like more than 90%. So it's probably similar here. So it's important for us not to make assumptions, jump to conclusions about who we know people are. It's important to, especially if our children are telling us otherwise. So it's important for us to listen to the young people in our lives, to listen to the children in our lives, to equip them with the tools and the knowledge about sex so that they can also work to, protect themselves and keep themselves safe as much as possible from experiences of violence. That is tonight's show. No breaks. Went straight through. I went straight through, and it was so natural. And yeah, this is me yapping, chatty. Another Tuesday night. I am excited for next Tuesday's conversation, and I hope you all will tune in. And I hope tonight's conversation was useful and that you're able to take something away from it. As usual, Pleasure Pulse is a safe, inclusive space where no topic is too big or too small. And I want you to have a pleasurable evening, and a pleasurable evening means a non-violent evening free from child sexual abuse. Take care and see you all next time.